hello everyone, and welcome to the Jeux Olympiques du Monde, Jour 16. So this is day 16 of the Sales Olympics. Man, we are breaking into a sweat now because we have only today and then we have tomorrow, which is going to be the always be closing ceremony. So welcome everyone. Welcome. First time visitor, 15th time visitor. I hope that everyone is catching the Olympic Games. I think that France and the US are playing basketball head to head today for the gold medal. So I just want to say this. I know there's been a lot of questions about who I'm rooting for and who has my heart and which country do I really represent. And I can tell you that without a shadow of a doubt, I am rooting for the team in red, white, and blue. So we're going to jump into today's topic. Today's topic is going to be what triggers a buyer into motion and what triggers a buyer to slow down. So there's a whole lot of movement that are going on within the deals that you have, deals that are open, deals that aren't quite yet open, deals that have gone through demo and discovery, and what can trigger someone to say, okay, I absolutely want to buy, I absolutely want to close now, or why don't we go ahead and put on the brakes until Q4 or Q1 or Q2, or maybe I don't even want to get moving at all. So before I jump in, if everyone could start jumping in the chat, I could see Kirsten, I can see Justin. Hello, everyone. Hello, Federico from Mexico. If everyone who is watching live could jump into the chat, tell me who you are and where you're coming from. And we're going to go ahead and jump into tour numéro 1, lap number 1 for today. So what is a trigger? So there are two types of event triggers, essentially. And what these are events that happen, either current event or a future event that is a planned event that is for sure going to happen, that is going to mobilize someone to actually do something. So, or mobilize someone to do something or mobilize someone to stop doing something. Hi, Robert. Notice that he's tuned in from Spokane. Hi, Bob from the UK. The UK. Sorry. I actually have a mug. Please, can I have some more? Say Charles Dickens mug. Anywho, what triggers buyer to buy? So a current event or a future event that has happened or is going to happen that is going to actually mobilize someone to do something about it. So there's a lot of different levers, and problems aren't digital, meaning it all comes down to priority. What am I going to prioritize something? Why am I going to prioritize this thing? And I want you to think of it almost like a tipping point. Like there's a tipping point of which someone's going, if they rise above it, then they're going to solve for it. Hi, Simone. Simone's tuning in. Y'all are distracting me today. And I have to stay on time today because I got to go to track right after this. Simone and I are actually going to the closing ceremonies tomorrow. Tom Cruise, Snoop Dogg, Billie Eilish, no big deal. Hi, Simon. Point being, current event trigger, future event triggers. The last time I'm getting off topic. It's something that happened or something that's going to happen. Simon, I'm going to use an example that you actually gave me that will trigger someone into actually solving for it or prioritizing to do something about it. So there's a number of different buckets. There's a number of different things that can happen, but it actually makes someone mobilized to buy. So a example of that, why don't we start with future event trigger first? So I have this TV in the background, and probably 8 or 9 months ago, my remote went down, meaning I couldn't change the channel. So I couldn't get local TV stations. And there's a relative amount of pain to that. Okay, I have to go at several different workarounds, but on my second remote, so on this remote, essentially right here, I can just hit the Netflix button and Netflix comes up. So I mostly watch Netflix. So number of different programs on there that I watch, but I don't watch a lot of local TV, primarily because it exhausts my brain because it's all in French and I can't get subtitles. So I usually tune into that only for educational purposes of like, okay, I want to sit here and I want to learn French by osmosis. So I hadn't solved for it. And there was a certain amount of pain to that of like, okay, what happens if something comes on that I really want to watch? But there was nothing that really made me want to watch the TV. Now, there was an event probably a month ago where France was in the Euro finals, and I wanted to watch the football game, the football match. And so I tried to tune into it live, and I noticed that I couldn't with this remote. So I went several different workarounds, but I was in the middle of the game whenever it actually happened. So I went several different workarounds, couldn't find a way in. So I basically just pulled it up on my computer and watched the game live from my computer. So there's a certain amount of pain there. But once I went through that pain, I was like, okay, but when is that ever going to happen again? So I still didn't solve for it. There's a certain amount of pain to solve for it. I have to go to the store. I have to find the store. I have to walk in. I have to speak French. That was the primary one. I have to speak French, and I have to get a télécommande. Simon, don't make fun of me for that, for however that sounded. But I have to get a remote in French. So I wasn't going to solve for it until Simon and I one day were talking through future event triggers and current event triggers. So I said, if you can find a future event trigger that someone doesn't know about, then all of a sudden you can mobilize them to buy. So he said, okay, so for example, you couldn't watch the football match the other day, so you're not going to solve for it now, though, because it's over. I said, correct. And he said, but what about the Olympics? And all of a sudden, the next day, I went to the Orange, and I went and I got a new remote, because he found a future event that made a master problem that was worth solving. So I realized at that point, thanks to Simon, hats off to Simon, that I wasn't going to be able to watch the Olympics because I didn't have local TV. So when you're going to actually mobilize someone to buy, is you find either a future event that's going to happen or a current event that just happened that mobilizes someone to buy. So beforehand, had a certain amount of pain, but I wasn't going to solve for it. It wasn't a priority until Simon found one that I was like, that would be devastating if I couldn't, if for several weeks, couldn't sit there and watch the Olympics. So there's a number of different types of triggers, but really they bust down into, there's probably thousands of triggers when it comes down to it, but there's 12 different buckets of them. And some triggers actually can hurt us as the seller if we try to trip them. Some triggers won't hurt us, but we can't affect them as a seller. So an example would be they get budget internally that all of a sudden increases. But then there's a big bucket of triggers that we can affect as the seller, but won't actually hurt us. So whenever I'm in the selling floor, the selling room, people, when they come inbound, they're usually either going to have a current event trigger or a future event trigger. The last thing that happened that made them hit the tipping point, that they're like, okay, I want to actually solve for this. It might not be the only impact, but it's the final one that they're actually trying to solve for. So whenever he found that future event, then all of a sudden I'm willing to solve for it. So current event trigger is the last thing that made them want to actually solve for it. And a future event trigger is something that's in the future that made them actually want to solve for the problem now. So when they come inbound, they'll have one or the other. When you really get deadly is when you can diagnose ones that are happening to them or will in the future that they didn't know. So that is lap number one. I'm going to try and stay on time as I can. Otherwise, I'm going to be late to track. In the first event, by the way, I literally tried to, from a literal perspective, translate track and field to Simon. Simon's kind of my French coach, whether he likes it or not. And I translated piste et chambre. And anyone who speaks French can ding in the chat on how terrible that is, that it's not piste et chambre. It's not a track and a field. But apparently it's not bad at all. It's something about athletics. That's all I'm going to say. So the first lap was, what is a trigger? And it's either the current thing that happened that was the last straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. Sorry, I'm laughing at Simon's comment. Piste et chambre. I want everyone to just look that up online and what that means. I mean, it probably means absolutely nothing. Like, here's a fun secret. I know that everyone in the US has Pret Manger, you know, that they're like, oh, it's a really fancy French restaurant. Well, that just means ready to eat in French. And actually, there's a missing accent mark over the E, so it really means nothing. Anywho, I digress. Trigger is either a current event that's happened that mobilized them to finally want to buy, or a future event that's going to happen that makes it worth solving for it right now. Okay, let's go into Latin number 2 so I don't miss piece de chambre. Latin number 2. So there are 3 types of triggers that you can go into. And full disclosure, sellers do go into several of these, but they usually go into the ones that are going to hurt them as the seller, or they try to go after ones that they can't affect. So the 3 types of triggers are I want you to imagine 2 circle graphs. By the way, there's an entire asset about this on flipthescript.com. If you go into written, it's the top asset on an object in motion. But I want you to imagine basically 2 circle graphs here. And on the left-hand circle graph, you have triggers. Can a seller actually affect this trigger? And on the left-hand graph, you basically have triggers that a seller can affect. And on the right-hand graph, you have triggers that aren't at the seller's expense. And then you have an overlap in the middle. So over here on the left-hand side, you're going to have, on the outer bucket, you're going to have triggers that a seller can affect, but the trigger is at the seller's expense. So a great example of this would be discounting. It's something that the seller can affect, and they're hoping that it will mobilize someone to buy. Statistically speaking, it actually will decrease the likelihood that they'll close. But it's an example of a trigger of, it's a current event that the seller reaches out and they're like, I'm going to reduce the price. So it's something the seller can affect, but it's something that's at the seller's expense. Another example of that is I'm going to throw in professional services. So it increases the likelihood that they can actually do something about it. So it's something that the seller can affect. So they affect it, but it's something that it is at the seller's or the company's expense. So they have to give over, professional services or some piece of the product. On the right-hand side, you have triggers that aren't at the seller's expense, but they can't actually affect these triggers. So an example of this would be, all of a sudden the person internally gets budget, or all of a sudden they get an increase of headcount of people that they can actually use to solve for the problem. Or all of a sudden, let's say that product builds another feature for you. It's not at the seller's expense, but the seller can't ultimately affect that. And these are the 2 buckets that I see sellers living and breathing and eating and dying in. They're asking about budget, and the things that they can control, they are taking a hit on. Okay, I'm going to discount, 5% or 10% or end of quarter discount, hoping that will mobilize them from they aren't actually going to buy to they are going to actually buy. And in the middle section here, you have triggers that aren't at the seller's expense, and the seller also can control. So in this bucket, you're going to have a number of different triggers that you can affect and aren't at your expense. But those are going to come down to, you guessed it, y'all know what I'm going to say, your diagnosing skills. So I can't necessarily affect that you have a problem or the size of the problem. But if the current size of the problem is the size of, let's say, Texas, of what the buyer believes, but the real size of the problem is the entirety of the United States, how the seller can affect that is they first have to figure out what the buyer believes and why, but then they diagnose all of the other states that are the problems that the buyer didn't know about. So what that triggers the buyer to do is say beforehand, when I thought that the size of the impact was this, I'm not going to actually do something about it. But now that I know that this thing exists, I'm going to actually do something about it. So Simon's example is a great example. Beforehand, I'm like, oh, I can't watch local TV channels if I ever want to watch something in the future. So I had a little pain, but the pain was gone. But afterwards, I'm like, I can't watch the Olympics if I don't actually solve for this. So those are the buckets that I would live, breathe, eat, and die in. But again, you have three types of triggers that are at the seller's expense, but they can control. You have triggers that aren't at the seller's expense, but they can't control. And another example of that is fear that they won't be able to solve for it. Okay, all of a sudden there are more internal stakeholders that are paying attention to this decision if they get it wrong. All of a sudden their budget was slashed and cut in half. All of a sudden, the board's coming in town and is paying attention to the decision that they made. And these are real triggers that happen all the time, right? But you can't control that. You can't control that their budget was cut in half. You can't control that they get more budget. You can't control that, they got more headcount to basically solve the problem. It's a positive effect for you, but you can't will someone into having more headcount. The only things that you really can control are the size of the problem that exists, and then as an after effect or a byproduct, the fear that they can't solve for it because you diagnosed these things that didn't exist beforehand. So there's only two types of them. There's current event triggers, things that just happened. And then there's future event triggers, things that are going to happen in the future that are worth me solving for it now. So I went and got a remote several weeks before the Olympics because I'm not going to go and try and get a remote at the point of the Olympics, because if I can't get one, then I'm going to incur the impact. So I'm going to start solving for the problem today based on the future event trigger that Simon found. So when I'm thinking about triggers, I'm going to try and stay out of these lateral buckets, but in the bucket in the middle, and control the things I can affect that are at my expense. Okay, that's lap 2. Tour numéro 2. How's everyone doing out there? Min Mather says we're the same age. Min, are you talking about people's age in the chat? I think I need to pay more attention to the chat whenever it's going on. If it helps, it makes y'all feel any better. It's not that I don't want to pay strict attention to the chat. It's because I'm so much of an introvert. I feel like this train is going in my brain. And then if I get distracted by something, it's like all these locomotives pile up at 80 miles per hour. So, Min, are you talking about people's age in here? What's going on in the chat here? Y'all are getting weird on a Saturday. It's all I'm about to say. I know it's day 16. I know that we have been doing this for a while, but it's starting to get weird in here. Justin, how's it going? Glad to have you back, Justin. I heard that James, y'all might want to send him a message. I heard that James is, his wife is having a baby. So first of all, congratulations, James. I don't know if the baby is born yet. Second of all, if there was any excuse to miss the Sales Olympics, I'd say a child being born is one of them. That's a real objection, folks. And third of all, I almost want to deem this child the Sales Olympics child. Sales Olympics child. Hi, Justin. Yeah. Okay. It was totally appropriate. That's good. Okay. That's good. I think we're in the semi-appropriate realm here today. Okay. So we're going to go into lap number 3. So now that we know what a trigger is. Oh, awesome. Robert said he's reading The Evolving Self. It's a great read. I'm so glad you're reading that. It is a very, very deep read. But you start to learn a lot more about yourself than anything. I'm like, oh, here I am at self number 2. So in that book, and then we're going to jump back in here. In that book, basically for everyone who's watching, I recommended The Evolving Self by Robert Keegan. And there's 5 different selves that you basically go into. across your lifetime, most people only make it to self number 3. Some people make it to self number 4, and very few make it to self number 5 in their lifetime. So if you want to read what those are, I'd go into The Evolving Self by Robert Keegan. It's not a do-gooder self-help book. It is definitely a very deep psychological book that I had to read sometimes through. Okay, 5 buckets of solution-centered triggers. So there are 3 types of triggers. Triggers that can hurt me as a seller, but I can affect. Triggers that don't hurt me as a seller, but I can affect. And triggers that I can affect and don't hurt me as a seller. That's the gold medal here. So I want to go into that there's 12 buckets. There's 12 examples of triggers, if you will. So there's 5 buckets. Let's go into the bad ones first. So there's solution-centered triggers. That is the normal buckets that people go into. So the first bucket is the resources that the solution requires. So I'm going to read a number of these. This asset is very, very long if you want to go pick it up, but on the website on written. But the level of ease to solve for the master problem, the amount of time that it would take to solve for the master problem, the amount of time that the prospect would need to invest to solve the master problem, the amount of resources that they would need to invest, the amount of money they would need to spend, the amount of money they would need to spend with you, or the amount of money that they would need to spend in comparison to other alternatives. So this is bucket 1, but this is the resources that the solution requires. And where this bucket is deleterious is it's mostly at the seller's expense. I trigger down the amount of money they would need to invest to buy the product. So it could trigger them to buy, most likely not, but it is at my expense. The second bucket of no triggers is the availability of the resources that the solution requires. So the first one was the amount of resources that the solution requires. The second one is the availability of those resources on the prospect end. So this one is going to be written with things that you can't affect as a seller. So they're not to your demise, but you can't affect them as a seller. Like the amount of time that they have left to solve the master problem, the amount of time that they have currently to solve the problem, the amount of resources that they have to solve the problem, the amount of budget that they have to solve the problem for the prospects department, and the amount of budget that the prospects department has available to spend on this project. Hypothetically, great buckets to trigger, but we can't affect them. I can't affect how much budget they're given as to solve the project. The third bucket, the third out of 5 buckets on the solution-centric buckets, which are the no buckets to focus on, is going to be the ramifications that choosing the wrong solution. So the amount of internal credibility that the prospect will lose if the solution doesn't solve the master problem, the amount of negative impact that the prospect's role and team will incur if the solution doesn't solve the master problem, the amount that the prospect's pain and business problem will increase if the solution they choose doesn't solve the master problem, the amount of time that they will lose deploying the first solution. Those are all things that you can't control. I can't control that more internal stakeholders are watching as they solve this problem. But it's something that if that goes up, if the amount of credibility they're going to lose goes up, then all of a sudden I am going to not want to solve for the problem. So you have to keep in mind with omission bias that people are 2 to 3 times more likely, more afraid of the ramifications of taking accountability if they mess up versus the ramifications of what happens to them if they stand still. So even if you're trying to go the COI angle, which statistically won't work, it's meaning it's going to make you lose credibility as a seller because it's the wrong agenda. It's not going to be as effective. You're going to have to outweigh, almost think of it of like the euro versus the dollar, at points where the euro was worth 3 times as much. I'm going to have to find 3 times the amount of impacts that happens to them if they stand still, hypothetically, than I am, when I'm trying to bend their mind, than I would to outweigh a third of what will happen to them that they're scared of if they actually use the solution and isn't effective in helping them solve their problem. The fourth bucket is the efficacy of the solution itself. So the amount of time the solution will be available, the amount of time will be available to give them price, the amount of time the solution will still be effective in solving the master problem, but it's basically around the efficacy of the solution. Good idea, but you can't control it. You can't control, well, the only way that you hypothetically can control this one is that you tell someone the solution won't be available for a very long period of time, which again is going to plummet your results, but this is an angle that people go. The other things that could happen is the efficacy of the solution. Hypothetically, if that increases, it might move someone to buy, but you as the seller can't affect that. You're not on the product team. So that's going to be bucket 4, is going to be the efficacy of the solution itself. And then the 5th bucket is going to be the efficacy, the prospect's efficacy in using the solution. So I can't increase their skill level. The only way I can maybe go about this bucket, this is the only bucket in solution centric that might have a little positive effect, but not enough, is when I diagnose things that they don't know, I make them more confident and I make them more equipped to solve the problem because they know things that they didn't know before. But in all case scenarios, whenever it comes to solution and trying to affect the solution or affect what they have available to spend on it, we can't control it, or it hurts us if we do. So that is the 3rd lap. And again, that was the 5 buckets of triggers that are solution centric, that are the bad triggers that most sellers focus on. I would say if they're going to focus on a trigger, they focus here. They're like, I'm going to discount, or I'm going to throw in pro services, or I'm going to try and convince them that we're the best solution for them. But you can't essentially affect it. I can't affect if they have more headcount or more internal resources to deploy the solution. And even if I can, it's going to be at my expense. Okay, let's go into tour numéro 4. Simon's probably vomiting if he's still listening to this. Simon's been great. He really has been great. We're going to the closing ceremonies together. And I hope that he knows, Simon, if you're still listening, that you're going to have to speak French the entire time. Not to me, to other people who are walking into the stadium. Okay, so we're going to go into the diagnostic triggers. So this is going to be the 7 buckets of diagnostic triggers that are the positive triggers that you can affect and that won't hurt you whenever you do. Okay. Bucket 6, the pain and the perceived pain. So the initial creation of a perceived pain, well, this is the bucket that most people focus on, but you really can't affect pain. Pain is always subjective, and it's to the person. It's the patient notices it first, by definition. This is where all sellers focus. Where you can hypothetically affect it is perceived pain. So think of pain and perceived pain in this facet. I am 7 meetings to 10 meetings, and that is the pain of my business problem as an SDR. But the problem I'm solving for is, yes, I'm a little bit behind quota. What I'm worried about is the VP of sales has told me that if we don't break cash positive, meaning isn't it worth it to have this SDR team, they're going to scrap the team by the end of the quarter. And where that number is 13 meetings per month. So the pain is 7 to 10. But the perceived pain is where they are right now, not to throw a wrinkle in here on day 16, where they are right now to the amount of lagging indicator they need to affect the outcome. So remember, there are 12 different types of problems: negative symptom-based problem, threat-based problem, lateral-based, sign-based, sign-based, prescription-based, goal-based, future metric-based, future event-based, amelioration-based, opportunity-based, positive symptom-based, and there's one more, goal-based. I think that's the one that I left out. So point being with the, success-based, that's the last one. So point being, a negative symptom-based problem, solving for the negative symptom. Where is my current lagging indicator to where is my goal? You calculate that. That is the pain. But the perceived pain is, where is my lagging indicator to where does my lagging indicator need to be to achieve the outcome? So in a threat-based problem, it's all of these types of problems are hinged off of the type of outcome they're looking for. In a threat-based problem, they're trying to avoid the threat. In a goal-based problem, they're trying to achieve the goal in the future. In a future metric-based problem, they're past their current metric, but they're getting a future metric issued in the future that if they stay as is, they're not going to hit that future metric. They're at 15 meetings to 10 right now, but their quota is going to be raised to 20 in the future. So there is no current pain. But the perceived pain is if I stay as is until that future metric comes into place. Once it comes into place, I'm hosed. I need to do something about it now. So perceived pain is 5 SQLs per month of when that future metric comes into place. So the perceived pain is what you can actually affect as a seller when you diagnose a threat they didn't know, or you diagnose a future event that they didn't know. So I would think about it like this, and I'm going to go on to the rapid fire, the other buckets. Pain and perceived pain is very similar to temperature and feels like. So they'll say it's 90 degrees outside, but it feels like 105 because of the humidity. And if y'all would jump into the chat, which one do you read it as the person who's in that weather? Do you read it as the 90? Which one does your body assume that the temperature is? Does your body assume that it's 90, or does your body assume the feels like temperature, the 105? But that's mirrored to pain and perceived pain. So the pain is their goal is a lagging indicator to their current lagging indicator achievement. The perceived pain is their current lagging indicator achievement to the amount of lagging indicator that needs to be achieved to achieve the outcome, essentially. So negative symptom base, the outcome is just alleviate the negative symptom. It means I'm in Dallas. That's what I was thinking of, Robert. My mom was like complaining about the temperature. Okay, so last buckets here. So bucket 6 was pain and perceived pain. Bucket 7 is pleasure and perceived pleasure. There are positive problems. They're on the latter end of the 12 problems, and you can find them on the website. Bucket 8 is the business problems. Bucket 9 is the tactical problems. Bucket 10 is the root causes. Bucket 11 is the current impacts, persona, horizontal or vertical. And bucket 12 is the future impacts, current horizontal or vertical. So some of the things that you can affect, I know I'm pretty close up on time, but for the things that you can affect in those buckets, again, are not the impacts that are going to become true. Simon didn't make something up. He simply diagnosed something that I didn't know, right? My dentist didn't make something up with my gums. They didn't make up the fact that my gums are receding. All they did was prognose an impact that I didn't know. There was no pain in the present. So, it's not about creating buyer intent. Doesn't come down to trying to get them to believe that the problem that you know that exists is more deleterious than it is. It comes down to finding the ones they didn't know that stack up into them. So I think of it like a competition. Let's say that you have a little bowl as your hands, and you have this jug of water that you got to fill up. And you have to go back and forth and put some water. And sometimes it's 2 inches of water. Sometimes it's just a couple drops. Sometimes it's a big, big pool of water. But they have to hit this tipping point of, is this worth solving for? So every time that you diagnose a future impact that they didn't know, a current impact that they didn't know, business problem they didn't know, root cause that they didn't know, tactical problem that they didn't know, or current or future event trigger you didn't know, maybe you're going to hit that lip. That is everything. Y'all, we made it. Heat index feels like. Exactly, Kirsten. So the reason I'm covering this concept last is because you didn't see it coming. I'm just kidding. Concept last is the most difficult part of, not that there is a difficult part. I'd say the most difficult part of diagnosing for people is just the mindset that you're going to do it, is starting. Once I'm bought into that, I learn, 5 facts, 2 facts, 3 facts, 4 facts, whatever about my buyer. All of a sudden, I'm just going to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow and grow, just like a doctor. Doctor spends 12 years in school. and residency and practice just to be able to diagnose. Pharmacists only spend 2 years, maybe 3. So pharmacists are after talking about the medications or the product, but the expertise for a doctor to be able to diagnose is much more. So the reason I bring these up last is a lot of the problems that come in are going to be negative symptom based. What they're looking to do is alleviate the negative symptom. However, I will say this. If you go to flipthescript.com and look up written, there's the 12 types of problems. If you're always going for a negative symptom-based problem, you run the risk of 2 things. Number one, when it's not a negative symptom-based problem, it's a threat-based problem, or it's a future metric-based problem, or it's a goal-based problem, or it's a success-based problem. They've been so successful, their lagging indicator, it's caused a massive problem in the present. Then you run the risk of your prospect getting more frustrated and shutting down because they're like, I'm past my quota. That's not what the problem is. I'm past my employee churn, or employee or retention rate. That's not the problem I'm trying to solve. The problem I'm trying to solve is I'm afraid of this threat in the future. So they shut down. They start to shut down. But the more deleterious thing is what happens if I'm only going after negative symptom-based problem, then I might not identify the master problem that they were trying to solve. So even though I increase their quota attainment and even though I increase their employee retention rate, they were at 85, their goal was 80, and I increased it, or let's say they were at 80 and their goal is 85, and I increased it to 85. That's fine. But their problem was they were worried about a threat that was going to happen in the future. If they lose more employees to this competitor, they're posting those every single time on the job board of employees that they won. So the threat actually becomes true. So they spent a whole bunch of time, they spent a whole bunch of effort, credibility, and focus on trying to avoid a threat. And you helped them a little bit, but the threat still became true. So in their head, the master problem still wasn't solved, and you were at the hand of it. So I've seen this a number of times in discovery, where people go in and they're like, my first clue is I'm like, what is the lagging indicator achievement, and what is the lagging indicator goal? If they're at 2 versus 10, then I'm like, I buy that you want to solve for that. If they're at 8 versus 10, I'm like, oh, I don't know. And if they're at 10 versus 10, sometimes I just say to them, I'm like, hey, can I just be real with you? Your meeting quota is 10, you're at 10 or 11. I don't really see what you're trying to solve for. And then they come out with something else. They're like, yeah, but I'm trying to make it to this next role. And if I don't surpass quota by 20%, then I'm not eligible for that. And the problem is they're starting to hire from the outside. And I am scared that they're going to hire and fill these 3 account executive roles. And that once they're filled, they're filled. So it will be a number of years before I can be an account executive in the future. They're at 9 and you get them to 10 if you're solving for a negative symptom-based problem. But they still don't become the account executive, which means they did all of that for nothing. So kind of in summary here, current event triggers or future event triggers are things that are happening that push us past the tipping point. It's the final straw that breaks the camel's back. So when I'm diagnosing and I'm finding these impacts, I'm finding these tactical problems, finding these root causes that they didn't know, I am tacking more and more and more into the reasons of why hypothetically they would want to solve for it. If from the selfish perspective, that's what you get as a seller, is there's more likelihood to buy, there's more urgency to buy, there's more budget they'll spend on it, there's a shorter time frame that, the problem is bigger, so they're going to spend more. They're going to go find the budget, and your credibility rises as a seller. However, I must underscore the heart and intention of all of this. The heart should be, I'm going to diagnose these things that they don't know because they don't know them, and that would hurt them. So it will help you as a seller, for sure. If you want to be the most, I want to be clear here. If you want to load a Corvette with a whole bunch of money and drive down Highway 1 screaming, I'm the Queen of France, for instance, on a scooter. But the heart should be, at least in my opinion, the thing that's going to be relieving for you at the end of the day of you're really actually helping someone. So when you diagnose those things, whether they mobilize or not, you just help someone because you help their education level and you just let them know that something's going to happen. Now, if they still don't do something about it, that's on them, right? Your job's done. You shake off the dust off your feet and you keep walking. However, the whole goal should be diagnose, 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 diagnose. And that eventually is going to be the only bucket that you can trigger someone to buy that won't be at your expense and that you can actually control. So that's everything. That's day 16. Tune in tomorrow for It's Always Be closing ceremonies, y'all. Why would you not want to come to that? I mean, come on. So we're going to be doing a recap of all of the 17 days. I'm going to go rapid fire, 60 seconds on each of the 16 topics that we've done so far. And then we're going to go into Q&A. So if you have any questions, you can either stack them up in the chat for tomorrow's, or if you want to just write them down in your notepad, you can put them in the chat as we go. But we're going to have a Q&A session. We're going to do a medal ceremony. So Simon will actually probably be with me in person at that point, so he can correct my French live. And then we are going to do some closing remarks. So tomorrow is going to always be closing, Robert. Always be closing. Always be. So this is it for jour 16 de les Jeux Olympiques du Monde. Are we dressing up for that? We should. So I've been wearing a lot of gear here. It's going to be 90 or 95 degrees tomorrow, though, in Paris. And as a reminder, we don't have AC because it's not natural. So of course we don't do that. So yes, you can wear shorts. Everyone can wear what they want. Just no Crocs, okay? And no pastels, please. It hurts my heart. Pastels, especially the light pink bugs me for some reason, and the lavender color really irks me. But other than Crocs, no Crocs is the only ask or request on my behalf. Or the one shoulder sweaters is also, they just kind of trip my mind out a little bit. It reminds me of that Chevy Chase Christmas Vacation movie with Faye. Anywho, see you tomorrow. As always, thank you for coming. Good to see everyone. Justin, Kirsten, Gianluca, Robert. I hope that you're there tomorrow because we have a little treat. Y'all have been incredible. So as always, I'm going to be cheesy and want to be French and say, à demain, merci pour tout, see you tomorrow, au revoir pour maintenant, et merci. Bye, everyone.